"I'm not giving you this house," shouted the neighbor, but the old woman showed a photo that made him collapse to his knees. The night was thick with the kind of damp chill that seeps into your bones, the kind that makes the streetlights on Maple Street flicker like they're struggling to stay awake. Millville, Ohio, wasn't the kind of town that made headlines. 2,000 souls, a diner on the corner of Main and 3rd, and a railroad track that rattled the windows every few hours. But tonight, something was brewing, something you could feel in the air, sharp and electric, cutting through the usual hum of crickets and distant car horns. It started with a shout, loud enough to bounce off the sagging porches and peeling paint of the old wooden houses. "I won't let you take this house. It's mine by right." Daniel Carter's voice boomed, raw and jagged, like he'd been holding it in too long. He stood by the splintered fence that marked the edge of his property, a broad-shouldered man of 45, his flannel shirt stretched tight across his chest, his dark hair streaked with gray at the temples. His fists were clenched, knuckles white under the yellow glow of the sodium lamps. Across from him, Margaret Thompson, Maggie to the few who knew her, stood still, a frail figure wrapped in a faded cardigan, her silver hair pulled into a loose bun. At 73, she looked like she could snap in a strong wind, but her eyes, sharp and unyielding, held a weight that made Dan hesitate, just for a split second. "You don't even know what happened here before you," she said, her voice low, steady, cutting through the night like a blade. It wasn't loud, but it carried, sinking into the cracks of the moment. Around them, the neighborhood stirred, curtains twitched, a dog barked down the block, and the faint screech of tires echoed from the intersection where Maple met Route 48. Dan's jaw tightened, his breath puffing out in little clouds against the cold. "What the hell are you talking about, old woman? I bought this place 15 years ago, cash in hand. It's mine. You've got no claim here." Maggie didn't flinch. She adjusted the collar of her sweater, her thin fingers trembling slightly, not from fear, but from something deeper, something Dan couldn't place. "Money doesn't settle everything, Dan," she replied. "Sometimes the truth costs more." She turned then, her worn sneakers scuffing against the cracked sidewalk as she shuffled back toward the little rental cottage she'd moved into 3 months back, just 2 doors down. Dan watched her go, his chest heaving, the anger still burning hot in his throat. He wanted to yell after her, to demand answers, but the words stuck, tangled up in the confusion her calm had left behind. He kicked the fence post, the wood groaning under his boot, and stormed back inside. The screen door banged shut behind him, a sharp clap against the quiet. The house smelled of stale coffee and pine cleaner, the kind of scent that clung to the faded plaid curtains and the scuffed hardwood floors. He'd lived here half his life, raised his daughter here until she left for college, patched the roof and painted the walls with his own hands. And now this crazy old lady showing up out of nowhere, acting like she owned the place. He dropped into the recliner by the window, the springs creaking under his weight, and rubbed his face with both hands. What did she mean, before you? He'd bought the house from a guy named Peterson, a slick real estate agent who'd moved to Cleveland years ago. Everything was legal. Deed, title, notary stamp. 15 years, no questions, no problems. So why did her voice keep echoing in his head, steady and sure, like she was reading from some script he'd never seen? He leaned back, staring at the ceiling where a water stain spread like a map of nowhere. Maybe she was just senile, lost in some delusion about the past. But those eyes, they weren't confused. They were certain. Too certain. The next morning broke gray and heavy, the sky pressing low over Millville like a lid on a pot. Dan was up early, the coffee pot gurgling on the counter as he pulled on his work boots. He ran a small garage out on Route 48, fixing transmissions and oil leaks for the farmers and truckers who kept the town's pulse going. But today, his mind wasn't on carburetors or invoices. He kept seeing Maggie's silhouette against the streetlight, hearing that quiet defiance in her voice. By 10, he couldn't shake it. He grabbed his jacket, a beat-up denim thing he'd had since the 90s, and headed out back to the shed. The shed sat crooked against the rear of his lot, its shingles curling like burnt paper, the door hanging loose on rusted hinges. He hadn't been in there in months, maybe years. Too much junk, too little time. But as he stepped onto the gravel path, he froze. There she was, Maggie, bent over in the half-open doorway, her cardigan slipping off one shoulder as she tugged at something inside. The air smelled of wet leaves and gasoline, a faint breeze rattling the bare branches overhead. "Hey!" Dan barked, striding toward her. "What do you think you're doing? This is my property." She straightened slowly, her movements deliberate, like she'd been expecting him. In her hands was a rusty metal box, the kind that might have held tools or fishing tackle once. She didn't look startled, didn't even blink, just met his glare with that same steady gaze. "I told you, Dan," she said, brushing dirt off her sleeve. "You don't know what this place really is." Her words hung there, heavy, like the damp air pressing down on them. Dan's pulse kicked up, a mix of anger and something else, something uneasy, gnawing at the edges of his certainty. "Get off my land," he snapped, stepping closer, his shadow falling over her. "I don't care what you think you're entitled to. I've got the deed, the law, everything. You're trespassing." Maggie didn't move. She reached into the pocket of her cardigan, her fingers slow and careful, and pulled out a photograph, old, yellowed at the edges, the kind that's been folded and unfolded 100 times. She held it out to him, her hand steady despite the faint tremble in her arm. "Look at this," she said simply. Dan hesitated, his breath catching for reasons he couldn't name. The shed creaked behind her, the wind whistling through the gaps in the boards. He snatched the photo, his rough fingers brushing hers, and turned it over. The image hit him like a punch to the gut. A young woman, maybe 30, standing in front of this very house, holding 2 small kids, a boy and a girl, both grinning wide. Behind them, a man leaned against a pickup truck, his face half hidden by a baseball cap. The house looked newer then, the paint fresh, the porch unwarped. But it was the woman's eyes that stopped him cold. Maggie's eyes, younger, brighter, but unmistakable. His mouth went dry. He looked up at her, the photo trembling slightly in his grip. Maggie's lips pressed into a thin line, her expression unreadable but heavy with something. Grief, maybe, or resolve. What is this?" he managed, his voice rougher than he meant it to be. She didn't answer, just watched him, letting the silence stretch until it felt like it might snap. The sound of a train horn rolled through the distance, low and mournful, vibrating the ground beneath their feet. Dan's mind raced, questions piling up like storm clouds, but before he could speak, Maggie turned and walked away, leaving him standing there, the photograph burning a hole in his hand. Dan stood in the shadow of the shed for what felt like hours, though the train's fading whistle told him it had only been minutes. The photograph was still in his hand, its edges brittle against his calloused fingers, Maggie's younger face staring up at him from a life he didn't recognize. The air hung heavy with the scent of rust and rotting wood, the kind of smell that clings to old places left to fend for themselves. He shoved the photo into his jacket pocket, the denim crinkling, and turned back toward the house. His boots crunched on the gravel, each step louder than it should have been in the stillness. Whatever game Maggie was playing, he wasn't about to let it unravel him, not yet. Inside, the kitchen was dim, the fluorescent bulb flickering like it was on its last legs. He yanked open the fridge, grabbed a can of Budweiser, and cracked it with a hiss that cut through the quiet. The cold metal pressed against his palm as he sank into a chair at the table, the same scratched-up oak thing his daughter used to doodle on with crayons. He took a long swig, the bitter taste grounding him, and pulled the photo out again. Maggie, the kids, the man, whoever he was, standing in front of his house. His house. The deed was locked in a filing cabinet upstairs, signed and stamped 15 years ago. He'd checked it a dozen times back then, made sure every I was dotted. So why did this picture feel like a splinter under his skin? He couldn't sit still. By noon, he was in his truck, a beat-up Ford F-150 with a dented tailgate, rumbling down Main Street toward the Millville County Records office. The town was awake now, pickup trucks idling at the gas station, a couple of kids kicking a soccer ball near the library. The office was a squat brick building, its windows smudged with years of dust, the kind of place where time seemed to stall out. Inside, it smelled of mildew and stale coffee, the hum of an ancient copier buzzing in the background. Dan approached the counter, where a clerk, some guy named Roger with a comb-over and a mustard-stained tie, barely looked up from his crossword. "I need records on my house," Dan said, his voice clipped. 312 Maple Street. Ownership history, whatever you've got." Roger sighed, like the request was a personal attack, and shuffled off to a row of filing cabinets that looked older than the town itself. Dan tapped his fingers on the counter, the rhythm uneven, his mind replaying Maggie's words, "You don't know what this place really is." What did that even mean? He'd lived there half his life, fixed the leaky pipes, shoveled the snow off the driveway every damn winter. It was his end of story. Roger came back with a manila folder, thin and yellowed, and slid it across the counter. "That's all we've got on 312, he muttered, already turning back to his puzzle. Dan flipped it open, the paper crackling under his touch. The top sheet was his deed, dated 1998, signed by Peterson. But beneath it, older records, names he didn't know, dates stretching back decades. Then he saw it: Thompson, Margaret and James, 1972. Maggie's name, clear as day, tied to the house 26 years before he'd ever set foot in it. His stomach twisted. Below that, a faded newspaper clipping, taped to the page. Tragic fire claims 2 young lives, Millville, July 1980. The article was short, just a paragraph about a blaze that gutted a home on Maple Street, killing 2 children, ages 4 and 6. No survivors listed, no cause. He gripped the edge of the counter, the wood cool against his palms. 1980. He'd been a kid then, 10 years old, living across town with his dad after his mom walked out. He didn't remember any fire, didn't remember Maggie or her family. But the house in the photo, it was the same one, no question. He thanked Roger, his voice tight, and left, the folder tucked under his arm. The truck's engine roared to life as he peeled out, the tires spitting gravel, his mind a mess of half-formed questions. If Maggie owned it back then, how'd it end up with Peterson? And why was she here now, stirring up ghosts? Back home, he spread the papers across the kitchen table, the can of beer sweating rings onto the wood. He dug through his own files, pulling out the purchase agreement from 15 years ago. Everything looked legit, except the signature. Peterson's name was there, scrawled in black ink, but something about it felt off, too smooth, like it had been traced. He squinted, holding it up to the light, but the doubt crept in anyway. Had he been conned? He leaned back, the chair creaking, and ran a hand through his hair. His dad had been the one to recommend Peterson, said he was a stand-up guy, an old buddy from the county office. Dan had trusted him, never thought twice. Now, Maggie's voice was in his head again. Sometimes the truth costs more. Across town, Maggie sat on the sagging porch of her rental cottage, a mug of tea steaming in her hands. The street was quiet here, just the rustle of leaves skittering across the pavement and the faint clang of a wind chime 2 houses down. Clara, her neighbor, shuffled over with a plate of oatmeal cookies, her slippers scuffing the wood as she settled into a rocking chair. Clara was 78, round-faced and nosy, the kind of woman who knew everyone's business but kept her own locked tight. "Saw you talking to Dan Carter yesterday," she said, her tone casual but her eyes sharp. "He didn't look happy." Maggie sipped her tea, the warmth spreading through her chest. "He's not," she said simply. "But he doesn't understand yet." Clara raised an eyebrow, breaking a cookie in half. "You sure you want to stir all this up? That house, it's been his for years. He won't give it up easy." Maggie set the mug down, her hands folding in her lap, the lines on her face deepening. "I didn't come back for easy," she said. "I came back to make things right." Her voice was soft, but there was steel in it, the kind that comes from carrying something heavy for too long. Clara chewed slowly, watching her. "After the fire, you left so fast. Nobody blamed you, losing Jimmy and the kids like that. But folks said you'd never come back." Maggie's gaze drifted to the horizon, where the sun was dipping low, painting the sky in streaks of orange and gray. "I couldn't stay then," she murmured. Every corner of that house was them. Lily's laugh, Tommy's little toy cars. But running didn't fix it. "This is all I've got left to do." She paused, her fingers brushing the edge of the mug, the steam long gone. Could she really face it all again? The memories, the pain, Dan's anger? She'd spent decades burying it, but now, sitting here, she felt the past clawing its way up, sharp and alive. Dan wasn't done digging. By evening, he was back in the house, the folder still open on the table, the photo propped against an empty beer can. He paced the living room, the floorboards groaning under his weight, the sound mixing with the hum of crickets outside. The fire, the kids, Maggie, it didn't add up. He stopped by the basement door, its paint chipped and peeling, a place he rarely went. Something tugged at him, a hunch he couldn't shake. He grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and headed down, the wooden steps creaking like they might give way. The basement was a mess. Boxes of junk, old furniture, a busted lawnmower he'd never fixed. The air was thick with dust and the sour tang of mildew, the flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. He kicked aside a cardboard box, then froze. There, half buried under a pile of rags, was a toy, a small metal fire truck, its red paint chipped, its edges blackened with soot. He crouched, picking it up, the cold metal biting into his hand. It wasn't his daughter's. It felt old, older than 15 years, older than anything he'd brought here. His heart thudded, a slow, heavy beat, as he turned it over in the light. Where the hell had this come from? The basement air clung to Dan like a second skin, damp and sour, the flashlight beam trembling in his grip as he stared at the toy fire truck. Its blackened edges glinted under the light, A relic that didn't belong, not to him, not to 15 years of patching drywall and mowing the lawn. He turned it over, his thumb brushing a patch of rust, and for a moment, he swore he heard something, a faint echo, a child's laugh, swallowed by the hum of the furnace kicking on upstairs. He shook his head, shoving the toy into his pocket, the weight of it dragging at his jacket as he climbed back to the kitchen. The house felt different now, like it was watching him, the walls holding their breath. Outside, the night had deepened, the sky over Millville a blanket of slate gray, the streetlights buzzing faintly on Oak Street where Maggie's rental cottage sat. Dan didn't sleep. By morning, the coffee pot was empty, the sink piled with mugs, and his mind was a snarl of questions. That toy, the photo, the fire. Pieces of a puzzle he didn't want to solve but couldn't ignore. He pulled on his boots, the laces snapping tight, and headed out, the truck's engine growling as he turned toward her place. Whatever she knew, he was done waiting for hints. The cottage was small, its clapboard siding peeling like old skin, a single light glowing through the curtains. Dan banged on the door, the sound sharp against the morning quiet, a dog barking somewhere down the block. No answer. He knocked again, harder, the wood rattling under his fist. Maggie! Open up! I know you're in there. The curtain twitched, and then the door creaked open, just enough for her to peer out. She looked tired, her cardigan hanging loose, her silver hair tangled from sleep, but those eyes, sharp as ever, met his without a flicker of fear. "What do you want, Dan?" she asked, her voice gravelly, like she'd been up half the night too. He pulled the toy from his pocket and held it up, the metal catching the porch light. "This was in my basement. Start talking." She stared at it, her breath catching, a small broken sound that made the hair on his neck stand up. For a second, he thought she'd slam the door, but instead, she stepped back, pulling it wider. "Come in," she said, turning away, her slippers scuffing the floor as she shuffled inside. The living room was cramped, smelling of lavender and dust, a faded couch sagging under a quilt, a wood stove ticking in the corner. Maggie sank into a chair, her hands folding in her lap, and nodded at a box on the coffee table. Rusted, dented, the same one she'd been holding in the shed. Dan stood, too wired to sit, the toy still clenched in his fist. "This is my house, Dan," she said, her voice steady despite the tremble in her fingers as she reached for the box. "And your father wouldn't be here without us." He bristled, the words hitting like a slap. "My father? What's he got to do with this?" "Stop with the riddles, Maggie, or I swear." She cut him off, flipping the box open with a soft clank. Inside were relics of a life he didn't know. Singed letters tied with twine, a child's drawing of a red truck smudged with crayon, a Polaroid of her with a man and 2 kids, the same one she'd shown him but clearer now. She held it up, her eyes locked on his. "This was us. Me, Jimmy, Lily, Tommy. 1980. Before it all burned." Dan's throat tightened, the toy suddenly heavy in his hand. "The fire," he said, more to himself than her, the newspaper clipping flashing in his mind. She nodded, her gaze drifting to the quilt, her fingers tracing its stitches. "It was July," she began, her voice slipping into something softer, distant. "Hot, dry, the kind of night where you leave the windows open just to breathe. Jimmy, my husband, he'd been drinking. Too much, like always." He knocked over a kerosene lamp in the living room. "I was in the kitchen, washing dishes, when I heard the crash. By the time I got there, it was everywhere. Flames up the curtains, smoke so thick I couldn't see." She paused, her breath hitching, and Dan felt the room shrink, the air growing thick with her words. "I ran for the kids," she went on. "Lily was screaming, Tommy just crying, curled up in his bed. I got to the hall, but the heat, it was like a wall, pushing me back. I kept trying, yelling their names, but the smoke. I couldn't breathe, couldn't see. Jimmy grabbed me, dragged me out. I fought him, clawed at him, but he was stronger. The last thing I heard was Lily calling for me before the roof came down." Her voice broke, and she pressed a hand to her mouth, tears spilling over her wrinkled cheeks. Dan stood frozen, the toy digging into his palm. He wanted to say something, anything, but the weight of her story pinned him in place. She wiped her face with a shaky hand and looked up. "Your father knew who started that fire," she said, her tone hardening. "And he took the house for himself." The words landed like a punch, knocking the air from his lungs. "What?" he managed, his voice hoarse. "My dad, he was just a county clerk back then. He didn't." "He did," she snapped, cutting through his protest. "He was there after, promising help, saying he'd handle the paperwork, get us a new start. But he lied. He forged the sale, pushed us out when I was too broken to fight. Jimmy drank himself to death a year later, and I left. Couldn't stay in Millville with their ghosts everywhere. She leaned back, exhausted, the box still open between them like a wound. Dan's head spun, his father's face flashing in his mind. Stern, quiet, always dodging questions about the old days. "You're lying," he said, but it sounded weak, even to him. He turned, pacing the small room, the floor creaking under his boots. His dad had been a hard man, sure, worked late, drank whiskey on the porch, died of a heart attack 10 years back, but this? Covering up a fire? Stealing a house? He stopped, staring at the wood stove, its faint crackle filling the silence. "Why should I believe you?" he asked, turning back. Maggie didn't answer right away. She reached into the box again, pulling out a folded letter, its edges charred. "Read it later," she said, holding it out. "Then decide." He took it, the paper crisp against his fingers, and shoved it into his pocket with the toy. "This changes nothing," he growled, but his voice shook. "That house is mine." She just watched him, her eyes steady, letting his words hang there, unanswered. He stormed out, the door banging shut behind him, the cold morning air hitting his face like a slap. The street was waking up, cars rumbling past, the distant clang of a train crossing the tracks, but all he could hear was her story, looping in his head, pulling at threads he'd never thought to unravel. Back home, he didn't open the letter right away. He sat at the kitchen table, the folder from the records office still spread out, the photo of Maggie's family staring up at him. His hands shook as he cracked another beer, the can sweating in the quiet. His dad had been his rock, taught him how to change a tire, how to fish down at Miller's Creek, how to keep going when his mom left. But now, Maggie's words gnawed at him, sharp and relentless. What if she was right? What if everything he'd built here, his life, his home, was on borrowed ground? He leaned back, the chair groaning, and closed his eyes, the hum of the fridge a steady drone against the chaos in his mind. Hours later, the beer was gone, and the house was dark, the only light a sliver of moon sneaking through the blinds. Dan pulled the letter from his pocket, unfolding it with hands that wouldn't steady. The handwriting was his father's, blocky, uneven, unmistakable. "Forgive me, Maggie," it read. "I didn't mean to." The rest was smudged, the ink blurred by time or tears, but those words were enough. He dropped it onto the table, his breath catching, the room tilting around him. What the hell had his father done? The letter lay on the kitchen table like a live wire, its smudged ink glowing faintly under the dim bulb overhead. Dan stared at it, his father's words, "Forgive me, Maggie. I didn't mean to," burning into his skull. The house was silent, save for the faint tick of the clock on the wall, each second stretching longer than the last. Outside, Millville slept under a sky heavy with clouds, the air thick with the promise of rain. He hadn't moved since he dropped the letter, his hands still curled around the empty beer can, the metal crumpled in his grip. His father's handwriting, those blocky letters he'd seen on birthday cards and grocery lists, felt like a stranger's now, a confession he couldn't unsee. He surged to his feet, the chair scraping the floor, and grabbed the letter, crumpling it in his fist. Enough was enough. Maggie wanted to rip his life apart with her stories. He'd make her prove it, every word, or shut her up for good. He yanked his jacket off the hook, the toy fire truck clinking in the pocket, and stormed out into the night. The truck's engine roared as he sped down Maple Street, tires humming against the wet pavement, the wipers swiping at a drizzle that had just started to fall. Oak Street loomed ahead, Maggie's cottage a dark shape against the glow of a single porch light. He didn't knock this time, just banged the door open, the frame rattling as he stepped inside. Maggie was in the living room, sitting by the wood stove, a quilt draped over her knees. She didn't jump, didn't even flinch, just looked up, her eyes steady, like she'd been waiting. "Tell me everything," Dan roared, his voice bouncing off the walls, the letter thrust out in his shaking hand. "Or I'll burn this place to the ground. I swear it." The threat hung there, raw and jagged, the air crackling with it. Maggie set the quilt aside, her movements slow, and stood, her frail frame somehow filling the room. "All right," she said, her voice calm, cutting through his fury like a blade. "Sit down, Dan. You want the truth. You'll get it." He didn't sit, just loomed there, chest heaving, but he didn't stop her either. She sank back into her chair, her hands folding in her lap, and started talking. "Your father wasn't just a clerk in 1980, she said. He was moving up, county assessor's office, handling property disputes, foreclosures. He knew everybody, knew how to pull strings. After the fire he came to us, Me and Jimmy. Said he'd help. Said the house was a total loss, insurance wouldn't cover it, but he'd make sure we got something to start over. Her gaze drifted to the stove, the flames dancing behind the glass. I was a wreck. Couldn't think straight, couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. Lily and Tommy were gone, and Jimmy was drowning in guilt and whiskey. Your dad, he brought papers, said it was a relief fund, a way to sell the land quick and move on. I signed, didn't even read it. Next thing I knew, he'd filed it as a full sale, forged Jimmy's name, took the deed himself. By the time I figured it out, he'd flipped it to some holding company, buried the trail. We got a check, $2,000, and a notice to vacate. Dan's knees buckled, but he caught himself on the arm of the couch, his breath ragged. You're saying he stole it? Just like that? Maggie nodded, tears glinting in her eyes. He promised me help, Dan. Stood there in my burned-out yard, ash still falling, and lied to my face. I was too broken to fight. Jimmy was worse. He drank himself dead a year later, left me alone in a rented trailer up in Dayton. I ran from Millville, from the memories, but they never let me go. Her voice cracked, and she pressed a hand to her chest, like the weight of it was still there, pressing down. He staggered back, the letter slipping from his hand to the floor. His father, stern, practical, the guy who taught him to throw a punch and change a flat, had done this? Built his life on a widow's grief? He shook his head, the room spinning. No, he said, more to himself than her. He wouldn't. He couldn't. But the toy in his pocket, the charred truck, felt like proof, searing through the denim. Maggie watched him, her face etched with sorrow, not triumph. I don't blame you, Dan, she said softly. But this house, it's my memory. My kids. I came back for them. The words broke something in him, a dam he'd held tight too long. He turned, slamming out of the cottage, the door banging shut behind him. The rain was heavier now, drumming on the truck's roof as he peeled away, his mind a storm of rage and doubt. He didn't go home. Couldn't face it yet. He drove past the diner, past the tracks, until he hit the edge of town where the field stretched dark and endless. He pulled over, the engine idling, and sat there, the rain streaking the windshield, blurring the world outside. His father's face kept coming back, those late nights at the county office, the way he dodged questions about the old days, the quiet pride when Dan bought the house. Good deal, he'd said, clapping him on the shoulder. Peterson's a solid guy. Dan's hands tightened on the wheel, knuckles white. Had it all been a lie? He leaned his head back, the seat creaking, and closed his eyes. The rain tapped a steady rhythm, mixing with the thud of his pulse. He'd built his life here, raised Emily, fixed the porch swing, grilled burgers in the backyard. If Maggie was right, it was all on stolen ground, every memory tainted. He didn't know how long he sat there, the night pressing in, but eventually, he drove back. The house loomed dark and silent, the drizzle slicking its shingles. He didn't go inside, headed straight for the basement, the flashlight beam slicing through the shadows. There was something he'd missed, something his dad had left behind. He tore through boxes, tossing aside old tax forms and fishing gear, until he found it, a small safe, rusted shut, tucked under the stairs. His heart pounded as he grabbed a crowbar from the workbench and pried it open, the metal screeching in protest. Inside was a mess of papers, deeds, receipts, a county seal stamped on half of them, and a letter, folded tight, his father's handwriting again. Dan unfolded it, his hands shaking, the flashlight trembling in his grip. I took the house to protect you, Dan, it read. Peterson wanted it for a development deal, would have bulldozed it if I hadn't stepped in. I didn't mean for her to lose everything. Sorry. The words blurred as he read them again, then again, the crowbar clattering to the concrete floor. His knees hit the ground, the cold seeping through his jeans, and he stayed there, the safe gaping open beside him. His father had known what he'd done, known it was wrong, and still passed the house to him like a gift. Dan's chest heaved, a sound between a sob and a growl escaping him. The rain pounded harder outside, thunder rumbling in the distance, shaking the foundation. He stumbled to his feet, the letter clutched in one hand, and grabbed a gas can from the corner, half full, sloshing as he hauled it upstairs. He stood in the living room, the familiar smell of pine cleaner and coffee replaced by the sharp tang of gasoline in his mind. The house, his house, her house, stared back at him, waiting. Would he burn it down and end this? The gas can hung heavy in Dan's hand, its sloshing weight a heartbeat against the storm outside. Rain hammered the roof, a relentless drumroll that matched the chaos in his chest. The living room stretched before him, shadows dancing across the plaid curtains and scuffed hardwood, every corner a memory. Emily's first steps by the couch, burgers sizzling on the grill out back, his father's rare laugh over a beer at the table. Now it all felt hollow, built on a lie scratched out in that letter. "I took the house to protect you, Dan. Sorry." He could smell the gasoline in his mind, see the flames licking up the walls, turning it all to ash. His grip tightened, the metal creaking, but something stopped him. A flicker of Maggie's face, her tears, her kids' ghosts trapped in that toy truck still in his pocket. He dropped the can, the thud swallowed by a crack of thunder, and sank onto the couch, his head in his hands. The rain battered the windows, streaking the glass like tears, and he sat there, letting it wash over him. Burning it wouldn't erase the truth, wouldn't undo his father's betrayal or bring back what Maggie lost. He'd spent 15 years here, pouring himself into this place, but it wasn't his, not really. It was hers, her memory, her pain, her fight. The thought settled in, heavy but clear, and when the storm quieted to a drizzle, he knew what he had to do. Morning broke gray and soft, the air smelling of wet earth and pine as Dan pulled up to Maggie's cottage on Oak Street. The gas can was still in the truck bed, untouched, a silent witness to the night he'd almost lost himself. He climbed out, his boots squishing in the mud, and walked to her door, the keys to the house jangling in his pocket. He knocked this time, softer, the sound muted against the dripping leaves overhead. Maggie opened the door, her cardigan swapped for a faded sweater, her eyes wary but curious. "Dan?" she said, stepping back, letting him in without a word. The living room was warm, the wood stove ticking, the quilt draped over the chair where she'd sat last night. He didn't wait, pulled the keys from his pocket and held them out, his hands steady despite the ache in his chest. "This is yours," he said, his voice rough but firm. "I don't want to live on your kids' graves." Maggie froze, her breath catching, her fingers hovering over the keys like they might burn her. Then she took them, her grip trembling, and tears spilled down her cheeks, not the broken sobs from before, but something quieter, deeper. "You're sure?" she whispered, clutching the keys to her chest. He nodded, swallowing hard. "I found my dad safe. The letter, he admitted it. Took it from you, lied to me. I can't keep it, Maggie." Not knowing that. She stepped closer, her free hand reaching out, and before he could pull back, she hugged him. Frail arms wrapping around his broad frame, her head barely reaching his shoulder. "You're better than him, Dan," she murmured, her voice warm against his jacket. "Thank you." He stiffened, then relaxed, the knot in his gut loosening just a fraction. Her gratitude felt strange, unearned, but it anchored him, tethering him to something solid after days of freefall. They stood there a moment, the stove's heat seeping into the silence, then pulled apart. "What now?" she asked, wiping her eyes with her sleeve. He shrugged, the ghost of a smile tugging at his lips. "We go to the county office. Make it legal. It's yours again." She nodded, a faint light sparking in her gaze, like a piece of her had come back to life. By noon, they were at the Millville County Records Office, the same squat brick building where he'd started digging days ago. The clerk, Roger, still nursing his crossword, grumbled as he processed the transfer, the keys officially passing from Dan to Maggie. Outside, the sun peeked through the clouds, casting long shadows across Main Street, the air crisp with the scent of wet asphalt and distant hayfields. Dan walked her back to the house on Maple Street, neither of them saying much, the quiet comfortable for once. She paused at the fence, her hand brushing the splintered wood, and looked up at him. "You didn't have to do this," she said. "Yeah, I did," he replied, shoving his hands in his pockets. "It's right." She smiled then, a real smile, small but bright, the first he'd seen on her. She unlocked the door and stepped inside, her slippers scuffing the floor she'd once fled. Dan lingered a moment, watching her silhouette against the window, then turned away, the weight of the toy truck still tugging at his jacket. He drove home, to his empty house now, just a shell of furniture and echoes, and packed a bag. Emily was in Columbus, working some office job. Maybe he'd crash there a while, figure out what came next. Later that day, Maggie sat in the living room of 312 Maple Street, the quilt from her cottage draped over her knees. The house smelled different. Dusty, yes, but familiar, like the faint trace of Lily's crayons and Tommy's toy cars lingered in the walls. She pulled the box from the cottage closer, lifting out the child's drawing, a red truck, smudged but vivid, and traced it with her fingers. The tears came again, but they were softer now, mixed with a peace she hadn't felt in 45 years. The wood stove wasn't here anymore, replaced by Dan's electric heater, but she could almost hear the crackle of that old fire, the good nights before it all went wrong. She leaned back, the chair creaking, and let the warmth settle in her bones. Could she stay here, live with the ghosts instead of running? For the first time, she thought maybe she could. Dan didn't stay in Millville. By dusk, he was at the train station off Route 48, a duffel bag slung over his shoulder, the truck sold to a guy at the garage for a few $100. The platform was empty, the air cool and sharp with the scent of diesel and wet leaves. The train rolled in, its horn a low wail that vibrated through the ground, and he boarded, finding a seat by the window. The lights of Millville flickered past. Maple Street, the diner, the tracks cutting through town, then faded into the dark sprawl of Ohio's countryside. He leaned his head against the glass, the rhythm of the wheels steady under him, and watched the horizon stretch out, gray and endless. He didn't know where he was going. Not really. Columbus, sure, but after that? The house was gone, his anchor cut loose, but the weight of it, the guilt, the anger, was lighter now. He'd done right by Maggie, given her back what his father stole. It wasn't redemption, not fully, but it was something, a start, maybe. The train rattled on, the fields blurring past, and he let his eyes drift shut, the hum of the engine pulling him into a quiet he hadn't felt in years. Where would he end up? He didn't have an answer, but for once, that was okay. Back on Maple Street, Maggie lit a lamp, its glow spilling across the room, softening the edges of the past. She set the drawing on the mantel, next to a photo of her and Jimmy before the kids, and stood there, the house breathing around her. The rain had stopped, leaving a stillness that felt like a promise. She'd lost so much here, too much, but maybe, just maybe, she'd found a way to hold on to what mattered. The night deepened, the crickets picking up their song, and she smiled again, faint but real, wondering what tomorrow might bring.